Okay, good morning, good afternoon, whatever the time of day may be. I think we even have some people who are participating from places where it might be evening or night. So we're really glad to have everybody here. I'm going to repost the link again for the slides in the chat window. So hopefully you have them there. So greetings, I'm Betsy Hill, president of Brainware Learning Company. We are recording our session today. We were also broadcasting live on Facebook, so if anybody's there on Facebook, hi to you as well. I reposted again a link to the slides. We will try to post them again a few times during the session so that if you've just joined, you'll be able to see a link to those. And we'll also make sure that there's a link when we send out the post-webinar emails and things like that. So there are a lot of ways you can make sure that you get them. For those of you who have requested a certificate of participation for professional development purposes, you will get that automatically if you indicated you wanted one when you registered. Depending on the number of attendees, we've got a pretty good size group registered today. It will probably take us about a week. But if you do not see, first of all, I would check in your spam folder because for some reason these certificates of participation love to go to people's spam folders. And if you don't see it there, just feel free to contact us if you don't have something by a week from today. As we go along, please feel free. It looks like everybody's found to the way to the chat window. And I'm going to try this again. I think that this link should work now. But if that doesn't work, rest assured we'll come back to it in a little bit. And if my colleague Karen is able to join us today, she'll be taking care of that. So questions, and either in the Q&A or in the chat window, and we will follow up. For now, I'm going to try to ignore the chat window. But please feel free to type your questions in there as we go along. And we look forward to addressing them a little bit later in the webinar. First, I want to say that most teachers work really, really hard, many way too hard. And at the same time, there are some skill gaps that we see as we work with schools and teachers around the country. There are knowledge or skills that we really feel could make teaching easier and more effective at the same time. I know that teachers would feel more confident and probably less frustrated if they had these skills to a greater degree than is typical. Not that many may not have them, but from what I see, these are the kinds of skills that are not being taught in teacher preparation programs, or if they are taught, they're taught more theoretically than practically. So, for example, when we get to the fourth item, the fourth skill on this list, it came from my son, who is just a few years into teaching, following a master's degree program at a top teacher training program. And when I asked him what he wished he understood or could do better, he talked about grading. So, in fact, he said, we discussed it, and I know what the good, practices are supposed to be, but it's not something we really practiced or that we had an opportunity to try out and get guidance on. So let's dive in. If you've attended one of our previous webinars, then this story, you may be familiar with it and my message. If so, because we have some people who may have heard this a few times, spend a few minutes thinking about who you could share this with. For everyone else, what I'd like you to do is to think about how you would define learning. We teach, presumably, so that students can learn. We talk about learning all the time, but usually we don't pause to think about what it means. So if you're so inclined and want to participate in the chat window, love to hear everybody's thoughts about how you would define learning. I'll give everybody a minute to see if anybody wants to venture into the land of defining learning. Okay, well, I'm not saying anything at the moment, but you're probably just getting ready to think about it. And there are a lot of ways that we talk about learning. We can characterize it in various ways. For the most part, in education and in a work environment, we focused on content and skills. And we spent a lot of time on the outcomes and measuring and seeing if we can tell whether somebody has learned something or how well they have learned it. But what we want to do today is to focus on learning as a biological process. So what learning is at that level is actually the making and strengthening of connections among neurons, forming neural networks in our brains. So the brain is a learning machine, and it builds itself through experience, through interaction with the world, to create and strengthen the connections that are useful and are used, and we form those in groups or maps or networks that are activated together. And so when we hear or see something, as we do in any learning experience, a network of neurons is activated. When a group of neurons have activated together previously or over and over again, it becomes more likely that activating one or more of those neurons will cause the others to activate across that neural network. And the more we activate the group of neurons, the stronger that tendency is. So this is the principle that neuroscientists refer to when they say neurons that fire together wire together. Memory then is the ability to reactivate that previously activated network. It isn't a storage vault or someplace we go in the brain to pull something out. It's actually not a separate place at all. It is simply the ability to reconstruct or reactivate that same set of neurons that were activated in the beginning. So the brain is composed of about 85 billion neurons. You'll see a variety of different numbers in different places, but the most recent research seems to support this. There are a whole lot of neurons, of course, in our brains. And here we're going to take a little bit of a jump down to the cellular level and take a look at the neurons and how they communicate. So this is a diagram of 3 neurons. Each neuron has a nucleus, which is that little dark circle in the middle, and 1 axon. You can see that the axon that's labeled coming out of the neuron. And that's the part of the neuron that carries electrical and chemical messages from that neuron to other neurons. The dendrites are the parts of the neuron that receive the messages. And each neuron has about 6,000 dendrites, so it's just covered, that whole surface is covered, getting messages from all kinds of other neurons, but one neuron going out to transmit that neuron's intention or that message to others. So these are like branches that connect. One neuron sends an electrical signal down the axon, and the space between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another is called a synapse. And that juncture where they're connected, those synapses, are actually where memory exists. So memory exists in the ability of neurons to connect in these ways through those synapses. And that's how neurons communicate with each other. So neurons talking to each other, communicating, sending these signals all over the place, is the basis of all human behavior, including learning. So this is an actual slide of brain tissue enlarged many times. 30,000 neurons would fit on the head of a pin. You can see the cell bodies, those are those little black dots, and the profusion of connections among those neurons. So those are the axons and dendrites connecting together at those junctures called synapses. So what you're actually seeing here, these are actually layers of the cortex. You can see pretty well the 6 layers of the cortex, and connecting up and down and then throughout at the same layers. And imagine each of those neurons activating, transmitting signals thousands of times a second. And so those messages are being carried to either activate other neurons, to calm other neurons. It's a very, very busy place in our brains. But our brains didn't start off with all these connections. So here are 2 more images of brain tissue from the cortex. The one on the left is from a newborn, and the one on the right is from a 2-year-old. So at birth, those 85 billion neurons are already ready to go. They don't have a lot of connections. They have a few that they start to develop in utero, but as you can see, there are certainly not as many as they're going to be in just a couple of years. And from the first time that those neurons are created in utero up to about age 2, each neuron in the cortex creates about 1.8 synapses per second. So this profusion of synapse connecting, not the creation of new neurons, but these connections among neurons happen very rapidly. And by a year of age, the brain has basically doubled in weight and size. And by the age of 5 or 6, it's almost adult size and weight, 90% of that. So remember that this growth doesn't happen because we're creating new neurons or something else. It's actually the connections among neurons that cause that absolutely amazing growth. And this creation of connections is what our brains do when we interact with the environment. So neurons from networks in different areas of our brain develop so that we can see, we can hear, we can talk, we can walk. And all of those interactions are creating these trillions and trillions of connections. In fact, what this slide really shows, the difference between the first and the second, is really a picture of learning. So I want to stop just for a moment and reflect on what this means for us as teachers and why this is so important. How does this make teaching easier? Well, it makes teaching easier because when I understand this, I don't have to figure out how to get what's in my head into someone else's. My job is, we don't transmit knowledge and understanding. My job as a teacher is not even to necessarily know everything about my subject, although it's helpful if I'm pretty well versed in it, because knowing everything, even if I could do that, does not let me actually transmit that to my student's brain. All I can do as a teacher really is to create the experiences that will help my students engage with their environment to create those neural connections that then they will be able to use to reactivate, to remember it. So it's really about creating that experiencing and recognizing that each student's brain has to connect, make those connections and go through those physical changes. So every experience we have, in fact, even the experience that you're having now in this webinar, is physically changing your brain. And everything we do in the world does that. So I'm one of those teachers who didn't at one time, as most teachers, have a thorough understanding of how the brain learns. And if I am one of those teachers, how do I choose instructional strategies? I can remember my own teaching experience, and I can tell you that many teachers I talk to have similar stories. When I taught high school, there wasn't much science of learning to speak of, and there certainly wasn't any neuroscience. So I did what most teachers do. I taught the way I learned, and when that didn't work, oops, okay, I'm not getting that picture there. I have this really cool picture that's supposed to be on the slide of a wall with a piece of spaghetti attached to it. So you're going to have to visualize that, the piece of spaghetti on the wall. So if teachers do know how learning happens, what they throw at the wall would be more likely to stick. And so that's what our first skill focused on, was understanding what is most likely to create those strong connections and enable the student to build that understanding in their own brain, create that physical change in their brain that comes from learning. But if I can't see the wall, I guess I can't see the wall here, and I can't even see the piece of spaghetti, I can't know whether anything's stuck. I guess this is a more apt analogy than I planned for it to be. And this is really what it means to teach without data. And I have to say, this really breaks my heart. I spend a lot of time working with data because of the way we approach implementation of our programs. So we're routinely sharing and dissecting data with teachers and administrators in the settings that we work with. trainers in a corporate setting as well. And I don't really know of a way to teach using data other than hands-on and with encouragement to really be curious. And fortunately, we get that opportunity a lot of the time. In fact, I had an article that was published recently in STEM magazine that basically takes the position that teaching is a STEM profession. The scientific method is alive and well and should be hard at work in every classroom, not just for the students' sake, but also for the teacher's sake. And treating ordinary, everyday data as if it were hypothesis on learning should be part of every teacher's practice. And it's not really that hard, but we don't see it being used nearly as often as it could be. So what I want to do is just sort of walk through a fairly simple example of the kind of real-life data that we come across and that we are working with when we are working with classroom teachers and administrators. And at this point, this was a fairly small district, so this was also in discussions at the district level. So here is data from a 5th grade classroom, which shows the results on a normative diagnostic reading assessment called GRADE. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. The district uses GRADE to predict results on state tests. So it covers things like word reading, word meaning, vocabulary, sentence and passage comprehension, and is that listening comprehension, as well as whether the student can read what's in front of them. So first, the basics of the chart, of course. In 4th grade, these students on average scored a 473 on this test, for which the norm, or grade level, was 453. So they were performing above grade level. In 5th grade, they scored 485 on average, a 12-point gain, compared to the expected improvement of just 3 points. So you can see the grade level norms in those lines that go across at the 453 and 3-point side of 456 levels. So expected gain is not huge on this test between 4th and 5th grade, but these students, as we can see, were performing above grade level and improved their performance between those 2 grades by 12 points. So what does this information suggest to you? And most importantly, what would you want to ask? Oops, sorry about that. I unshared what I didn't mean to. Oh no, it may be okay. Apologize for that, clicking the wrong button there. I'm going to check the chat window and see if anybody has any thoughts on what kinds of questions you'd like to ask. Oh, I'm seeing that there were a number of comments on learning, making previous connections to past experiences. That's great. Developing cognitive or physical skills. Absolutely. All those are really good. So what I always encourage is at least a couple of questions. One is why, okay? Why is this? And the other is, what would have to be true? So the questions that, in addition to that tend to come up here are, okay, so it looks like we've got a pretty well-performing group of 4th and 5th graders. They were on average performing above grade level. This district has a very good reputation, actually, for its levels of education and performance on state tests and all of those kinds of things. But I bet some of you have some questions here. These are averages from a class, one 5th grade class, and this is in the US, actually in Pennsylvania. So one of the first questions that comes to my mind is, what about different subtest areas? What about different groups of students, not just what the averages are? I bet I'm getting another comment like that. what were they doing to get that big jump, better than grade level increases? You might ask if this is a gifted class or a high level track of some kind. So those are the kinds of questions that might occur and should occur as you're looking at this kind of data. We can feel very good about it, but when we dig in a little bit more, we're going to see some other things. So what we've done here on this slide is we've broken down because averages are not always as useful as digging a little bit deeper. So here we've broken it down into some subgroups. You can see all, which is the average that was we showed on that previous slide, and the fourth and fifth grade on the left, fifth grade on the right in the darker orange bar. And then you can see core and below core. So what that means, core means those who are reading at or above grade level, and below core means those who are reading below grade level. So the average, if you're reading at grade level, is quite a bit above grade level. But the average, if you're not reading at grade level, is substantially below grade level. And this is actually pretty typical. Many classrooms will have this very stark contrast between the students who are getting it and are on track and those who aren't. We can also see that over the course of their fifth grade year, I need to explain a couple of other bars here. The IEP bar is those students who are in special education and have IEPs. And the FR set of bars is for students who are categorized as free and reduced lunch. And you can see, of course, that in those cases, in fourth grade particularly, the students were not performing as well. And they were all performing, or at least on average, all of these students were performing below grade level. Over the course of their fifth grade year, these students improved significantly and all surpassed their expected growth. And in fact, on average, all of the students now, even in these subgroups, are now performing above grade level. So, what questions would you have now? Well, I hope you're asking why again. And I hope you're asking what would have to be true. So I referred to closing the gap. And of course, this is a goal that almost all schools and districts are working on, and the achievement gap, particularly for these subgroups. So we could actually take a look at this data a little bit differently and ask ourselves how these changes might contribute to a district-wide goal, for example, of reducing the achievement gap. So all I've done now is show the average difference to core and the reduction in that. And then, so we can see that the below core students improved or closed the gap by 26%, the IEP students by a whopping 71%, and the free and reduced lunch students reduced the gap to core. They were not quite as far behind, but that's reduced by 22%. So now what we can see is that this fifth grade teacher can actually see quite clearly the contribution that he or she is making to the district's goals for reducing the achievement gap. For those who are wondering what helped create this dramatic closing of the gap, this was an implementation of Brainware Safari, cognitive training software, which helps to develop the underlying skills that are necessary for reading and for math and all of the other kinds of things. And we'll talk a little bit more about cognitive skills in a minute, but these are underlying skills like attention and working memory and other executive functions, visual processing skills, processing speed, all of those kinds of basic skills that are what enables us to take information in from the outside world and process it efficiently and accurately, and then be able to retrieve it when we need it. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of an idea of how we can walk through some data that's very hands-on, that's very real to teachers, that they know these students and they can see what's actually happening, and help them understand how it relates to the broader goals of the school and the district. Now, one of the ways that data is and should be used is to differentiate student instruction. So that's the next skill we're going to explore. There's a ton of advice on the internet about how to differentiate, and I'd love to hear from you, from the attendees today, what it is that's actually making its way into your classroom. So again, I'd love it if anybody would share in the chat window ways that you try to differentiate instruction, or where the focus of differentiation is perhaps in your school or in your district. And again, I'm going to go and see if I can take a quick peek at the chat window. So thanks, Renee, and Lindsay both identified the identification of the interventions to get that kind of growth. That's terrific. All right, when it comes to differentiation, any particular favorites, any particular pet peeves, any particular questions about the kinds of things that you come across in ways that teachers are trying to differentiate instruction? Let me give everybody just a moment here. Okay, well, what I want to do is share with you some things that internet search cropped up. And these are things that happened, that came up quite frequently in this kind of a search. I know there's a lot of a lot of ways that teachers are being urged to differentiate. Oh, incredibly challenging to do given all types of learners. Absolutely. And we'll actually talk some more about that. Different methods to ensure that learning styles are addressed in the class. Okay. So those are very common. Learning styles, ability levels, performance on formative assessments is a way that people differentiate. Student interest is another way. So giving students choices about topics and the kinds of outputs or products that they are having. And the couple of comments that have shown up in the chat window, one was about how difficult it is because we have so many different types of learners. And then as well to trying to focus on different methods for different learning styles. And there's a difference between learning styles and types of learners, or ways that students learn. So I want to tackle these each a little bit. So these are, again, I want to emphasize that the differentiation is absolutely critical, but I'm going to take a position right now that only 2 of these will actually deliver. And without technology, only 1 is something that teachers can routinely do in most classrooms. And I'm also going to take a similar position on the effectiveness of these approaches. And in this case, 1 is actually counterproductive. So the first one, differentiation on the basis of learning styles, is actually counterproductive. Learning styles have been debunked. What we know now is that learning that is multisensory and an approach that involves a variety of different senses, not trying to cater to one individual way of taking in information, is really important so that we have multiple ways to retrieve the information that we learned. So we all learn visually, we all learn auditorily, we all learn kinesthetically, and through smell and touch and a variety of different ways, unless we have a profound cognitive deficit in congenitally in one of those areas. But in those cases, we still actually use and repurpose that part of our brain. So if what we do is we limit, or we try to direct one particular kind of input, whether it's auditory or visual, to a student, we're really depriving them of an ability to create multiple paths to access that information. And in fact, if you ask students what their preferred learning style is, they may have a preference, but that doesn't necessarily serve them well, because we want them to develop visual skills and auditory skills and the ability to integrate all of those kinds of information. When it comes to ability, this is something that typically I think would look something like, I have 3 reading groups in my class: strong readers, the average readers, the low readers. And often the only differentiation is really the pace at which students progress, and how much we repeat the same instruction. This strategy would make sense if all the students at that ability level were performing at that level for the same reason. But as we're going to see, it's not something we could take to the bank. That generally is not the case. So then we're going to talk about not learning styles, but learning different ways that people learn, different cognitive strengths and weaknesses that students have. Performance on formative assessments, that can be very useful in helping teachers identify gaps in student learning. So for example, I might look at my formative assessment data and say, okay, well, my class this year didn't really get infinitives in language arts, and we have obviously, looks like percentages was also a stumbling block for them. So I need to spend more time. I need to revisit those topics because they just didn't get it the first time through. And that's great, again, when all or virtually all of my students miss the boat on something. But when it comes to grouping or differentiating, again, it doesn't tell me why some did and why some didn't. On the last approach, differentiating on personalized basis on student interest, the news is mostly good. It doesn't typically take teachers a lot of time, and it doesn't result in better, and it does result, sorry about that, does result in better student performance generally. So letting them focus on topics of high interest, letting them choose different ways of demonstrating mastery, those are doable, and they also support learning. One caution here would be not to use this to as a way to let students lower expectations that you have of them on certain kinds of assignments. So for example, if oral presentations or writing skills are important for students, then enabling them to avoid those all the time, of course, isn't going to help them develop and demonstrate those skills, and wouldn't be doing them a favor. So where does this leave us in terms of differentiation? It leaves us with a conundrum. As we know, we need to differentiate because students learn differently, but we can't really rely on learning styles and their preferences. And we've just suggested that we can't trust typical ability groupings. So but learning differences do really matter. And what can we do about them? Well, this chart illustrates what we call the cognitive infrastructure for learning, or the cognitive foundation for learning. Ability groupings and formative assessment data all operate at the second level of this chart, where it says language arts and STEM. This is where reading and math and writing and science, even social emotional learning. So our ability groupings are really determined at this level based on success or lack of success on specific kinds of tasks and assessments. But what we do know is that, and learning styles were an effort to get below the surface, of an effort to figure out how to better get information to our students through their attention filters, into working memory, into long-term memory. But we didn't have those terms initially. And so it turns out that that was a wrong model for that, an incorrect interpretation of how information gets into the brain and is processed. And so what we're starting to appreciate is that there's some really important mental processes that vary significantly among students. So this makes sense intuitively, but today we're really increasingly able to give those processes names and understand their relationship to the learning process. So here we see, for example, at the bottom of this chart, what we refer to as foundational cognitive skills. These are things like attention and visual processing, auditory processing, sensory integration, some of our very short-term memory skills. And we know that when these are strong and operating efficiently and accurately, that's great. But if they're not, that may prevent some students from really getting a good start, a good foundation, if you will, to the learning process. On top of that are executive functions. Here, the core executive functions are working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. Working memory is essential for reading comprehension. That's how we actually comprehend, is we hold information in working memory and relate it to what we already know. It's where we think about it. Inhibitory control is critical in reading and in math, and I would also say that working memory is obviously critical in math as well. When every time we're doing problem solving and thinking about the aspects of a problem, that happens in working memory. And cognitive flexibility. So for example, even the ability of our brains to shift back and forth between reading sight words and sounding words out, which are two different pathways in the brain, requires that cognitive flexibility, that ability to shift back and forth between those two different processes. And so when we recognize that there's all of this stuff that goes underneath, it turns out we now have some tools that help us understand how our students or our learners vary across many of these different cognitive processes. So here's an example of the kind of information we can get from understanding what's going on beneath the hood or inside the brain or in those mental processes. And this is where an individual student's strengths and weaknesses really come to, or been able to actually to visualize those. So this is an example from something called MindPrint. It's a nationally normed, scientifically valid cognitive assessment developed at the University of Pennsylvania, the School of Medicine there. And it's great because it's online. It can be administered by a teacher in about an hour. And we get some really rich and very important information. So in the past, this has often been the domain of school psychologists because most teachers did not have the experience or the knowledge base to translate this into differentiation and instruction. But we now have that ability to connect these things, and it is actually quite easy with this kind of a system for teachers to be trained to do exactly that. So we're gonna take a little bit of a look about how we, again, we're gonna look at some data, we're gonna look at some students and see what all of this means. But if you look at this particular student, this is a profile for an individual student. You can see that on the right-hand side in that purple box at the bottom, working memory is a weakness. So this student, if they're struggling in math because of working memory, is going to be very different from a student who is struggling in math because of spatial perception or spatial reasoning. Those are going to be two very different kinds of things. So you probably all know this student with working memory issues, and it sort of goes like this. Johnny, would you please hang your jacket up at the door and go to your desk and sit down and turn to page 33 in your reading book? Well, Johnny probably gets to hang up his jacket and then he's looking around and is lost. And the teacher can interpret this a number of different ways. Might interpret it as saying, well, Johnny wasn't paying attention. Johnny, you've got to pay attention when I tell you things. Johnny's attention skills, as we can see here, are just fine. They're in the expected range. It's also not that he's trying to be difficult or, obstinate. What it really is that his brain simply can't hold on to that information over that period of time. Poof, it's gone. So now what I want to do is, and you can see where the strengths are, you can see all the skills that are in the expected range. So how can we take this and really look at it maybe on a bigger basis across a class or a district or group of students, and really understand what this can mean for differentiation in instruction? So this chart is actually simpler than it looks. And so again, I just really want you to hang in with me for this, because there's a payoff and it's a big one. So what this chart does is plot the performance of every fifth grade student in a particular school district. This is a different fifth grade school district than the other one that I showed you, but nonetheless, it turns out it's also fifth graders. This is real data, but not real student names, of course. And the scores are plotted on 2 dimensions. So the x-axis is verbal reasoning. This is how students can think with information that involves words. The y-axis is their performance on a test of spatial perception or spatial reasoning. So it's their ability to think about spatial relationships. And what we're looking at here with the dots is their performance on the Math iReady assessment. So here we're going to correlate their cognitive strengths and weaknesses with their academic performance and see what we can learn from that. The blue bubbles are the students who performed well on both of those cognitive assessments. The green bubbles are those who performed well on verbal reasoning, but not so well on spatial reasoning. The light yellow dots are those who performed well on spatial reasoning, but not verbal reasoning. And the orange at the bottom left quadrant are those who performed below average in both areas. So one of the things that we can see is that, so we've got some students who are doing really well. The size of the bubbles means how well they did. If it's a dark bubble, that means that they were above average on the iReady test. But you can hopefully see this one little white dot here, Norm, in the bottom upper quadrant. And Norm performed below average, despite the fact that he performed well on both the cognitive tests. And it turns out we have students in each of those. So if what you do is you take the students who performed poorly on the iReady math test and group them together, you're going to have in that group both green bubble students and yellow bubble students. So you have students who have strong verbal reasoning and have students who have strong spatial reasoning, but they lack in those other areas. And this is really critical, because for the green bubble students, those who did better on verbal reasoning, we're going to need storytelling, context, verbal cues, ways of thinking aloud verbally about math problems, and then we're going to be able to layer in the visual information. That's going to be really critical for them to really learn and take in and be able to manage this information. On the other hand, those yellow bubble students will be completely lost if we do that. It's going to do them no good at all. For them, we need to start with pictures and images. So if we treat them the same, whichever way that happens to be, we're going to be lucky to hit 50%. We certainly aren't going to be differentiating in any way that really supports learning. So what I did is to emphasize this by drawing some ovals around 4 students, one in each quadrant that have white bubbles. So that means that they didn't do very well on the iReady. And typically what we would do is we would group those students into one group to help them and to support them. But here's what I can tell you about them. So Norm, I mentioned before, he's clearly able, good verbal reasoning skills, good spatial reasoning skills, but he performed below standard on the iReady math test. Maybe he just had a bad day. That was my first guess, I have to tell you. But it turns out that's not the case. In fact, he has issues with executive functions, with attention, working memory, and flexible thinking. Just giving him more math instruction will be pointless. Norm can be supported by giving him the right kinds of supports and strategies in the areas of executive functioning that are weaker, and by helping him develop those skills. That's what he needs, not necessarily more math instruction. With those supports, he will get it because he's got strong reasoning skills. Zia, who's down on the very bottom left, very different kind of student. She's in special ed. She needs significant supports in a number of areas. And while she was identified as needing an IEP, so she's actually getting those supports, I can tell you that there are a bunch of students in that quadrant who are performing below grade level, who are not identified, and are not even part of tier 2 or tier 3 support. So they're just not getting the kind of support that they need. Now we can see exactly what their areas of strength and weakness are and what kinds of supports we can provide them. Sally and Sunny, you can see those circled, the yellow and the green area are the poster children for that group differentiation we discussed on the previous slide or before I put the circles up. So these are the kinds of cognitively based distinctions that teachers can address efficiently and with a tremendous impact. We have an amazing opportunity to provide differentiated support in a really scalable way that has a far greater chance of actually helping students perform better. So that was some of the information that I wanted to share with you about really looking at differentiation potentially in a different way. The next area is grading. And I have to tell you that my true confession is I hate giving grades. I hate giving grades. But the reason that I wanted to address this topic, of course, is my son, as I mentioned. He's an English teacher in Portland, Oregon. But he talked about skills that he could use support in. This really resonated with me. I don't know how teachers today question, or whether they question, or the degree to which they question why they have to assign grades. I didn't, at least in any active way, for many years of teaching. Assumed, as most educators do, I think that we give grades because students and their parents need to understand the quality of the work that they're doing. But I have a very different point of view today. And if the purpose of grading is to support learning, then we need to do some rethinking. If it's something else, then don't even share it with the student. If the purpose of grading is not to support learning, it's doing the student absolutely no good. But if we do want it to support learning, there are a couple of concepts that we can perhaps take more to heart than we do. So this is a rubric is one example of this that I want to share as one of those concepts. This is, well, I skipped over this one. I thought I had that a little bit backwards. There's a wonderful YouTube video with Carol Dweck, who is, of course, known for her growth mindset work. And she describes a school that had a grading system that was something like this. If the student hadn't reached mastery yet, he got or she got a grade of not yet. All that means is that it's an acknowledgement of learning as a process, a continuum along which we are all at different places. So just because I didn't complete some assignment or test at a particular level on a particular Tuesday at 10:30 in the morning doesn't mean that I can't or I won't. With the necessary effort, the appropriate support, the right kind of instruction. So this makes the distinction between when one is learning and when one has learned. And those who are deemed learned by their communities or their peers know that they're still always learning. So as far as I'm concerned, again, if the purpose of grading is something other than supporting learning, we can just, it doesn't matter what it is because it's not really helping students. One practice that I just want to touch on briefly here is called rubrics. These are much more pervasive than today than when I was teaching or started teaching many, many years ago. And there are a couple things. This is a rubric that I use in an MBA class that I teach on strategic thinking, or it's part of the rubric. There are multiple elements. And I really try to emphasize to my students that it's a continuum. We start off, we emerge, we get to competency, and sometimes we even get to some areas where we're truly a strength. It's something where we can really start to transform what it is we're working on. And I'm thinking actually now about changing the word exemplary to transformative. So I do want to point out that each level of the rubric that I have here is associated with a percentage score or a range of percentages. The MBA program that I teach in has percentage standards for grades, and so I have to have those. If I had my way, I'd skip that altogether. The levels are useful for students, the points are not, because you all know what happens when there are points associated with it. Students chase points, they chase points and half points, and that really doesn't do them any good, and it doesn't really reinforce learning. If I were working with a group of teachers, and as I think about grading today, here are the questions that I would want them to consider for whatever system they use or whatever they want to consider, which is really not about the grading. It's really about the process for feedback and grading support for learning. So for example, I always let my students redo assignments. If they came into my class and they aced every assignment the first time, I don't know why they're in my class. So what I want to see is learning. What I want to see is progress from that first attempt to a second attempt, or even sometimes a third attempt, but usually it's 2. Do I use assessments and feedback to move students from wherever they are to competency? Do I really focus on not yet to yet? Do I really understand what the critical skills are that need to be developed for each assignment? Sometimes we have a lot of points for things that may not be really representative of the skill that we're trying to develop with that assignment. And then can I use something other than a grade? Feedback, input. I give my students a lot of feedback on ways that they can get closer to sort of the that level of competence, that ideal or that standard, with very concrete suggestions and ways to approach that. The last skill I want to talk about is optimizing one's own learning. And this, we're going to come back sort of to where we started. We want teachers to be lifelong learners. The knowledge base and the skill set are constantly changing. As my beloved mentor, Pat Wolf, has said, the teaching profession is moving away from folklore to science. And so what do teachers need to know to optimize their own learning? How can they take that information, the kinds of things that we talked about in that first skill, and actually really apply it to their own learning? There are a lot of things, of course, that can come in here. We're just going to mention a few. For those of you who really want to dig in even deeper, there's a wonderful book by Dr. Terry Doyle called The New Science of Learning. He did a webinar with us recently called Stop Running Against the Wind. And you might check out either of those for a lot of great input on adult learning. So I want you to think back to what we talked about what learning is and about how we can strengthen learning with an understanding of how learning happens in the brain. And I want to see if how we might apply that to specifics, so to teachers and their own professional development. So here are 3 questions. What should teachers ask themselves before any professional development? What should teachers do the day before they're going to be teaching using a new technique or teaching new material? And there are a lot of learning communities that I see where teachers are discussing books, and many of these are wonderful, energetic groups. But just based on what we know about how the brain learns, how could they best prepare for a group discussion? So first, what do you think every teacher should ask him or herself before they do any professional development? Everybody's got something in mind, I'm sure. And my answer, at least, is, there may be other things that you can come up with. Why am I learning this? So relevance or rationale is absolutely critical. Our brain's primary responsibility is to help us survive. So our brains are going to pay attention to what's going to help us survive and not very much to what we don't think is very relevant. Which means also that those who are choosing PD for teachers, if that is the case, had also be pretty clear on this and help teachers understand that rationale or the relevance for learning. I can give you many examples of when that doesn't happen, including in my own MBA program. But if I get it, if I understand how this is going to help me, if I really believe that this is going to make a difference for me and how well I thrive and survive in my environment, I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to it. Without that rationale, learning simply won't happen. How about what they should do the night before an important event, using a new technique, participating in important professional development, whatever the case might be? Well, here we want to take a page from Garfield. We totally underestimate, most of us, the value of sleep, except Garfield, of course. Here's what the research says about sleep. If you've been awake 19 hours straight or longer, your brain functions as if you were over the legal limit for drinking. Your reflexes, your decision-making, your ability to problem solve are significantly impaired. Sleep is when memory gets encoded. So if we don't get that encoded, it's gone. It helps solidify memory against new learning, that interference that comes sometimes from learning something new. And it makes new connections to what you already know. It helps you problem solve. If we don't, imagine you're teaching using some new approach or some particularly challenging material, or it's one of those days, like right before a vacation or something when the kids are a little bit crazy. You get to your classroom, you don't focus very well. The first time a student breaks a classroom rule, you want to throttle them. You forget key points that you want to share. Well, you get the idea. Most of us have been there. And it takes a toll both on our success in the classroom as well as our health and mental health, physical health, and our general well-being. But when it comes to professional development, here's one of the things we can also say is that sleep is, again, what helps encode information in long-term memory. Adults need 7 to 8 hours a day, except for a very few people who thrive on 4. But if you're not one of those, and you're unlikely to be one of those, you do need 7 or 8 hours of sleep. So, and here's one of the things that I really want to point out on this chart. If you look at the sleep cycles, most of you are familiar with the concept of sleep cycles. 4 is deepest sleep. That level 1 with the bars across the top is REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. It's REM sleep when memory gets encoded. So if you're getting 4 hours of sleep a night, you're only getting a couple of REM cycles during which memory can be encoded. This is important for students as well. If we're getting 8, we're getting several more REM cycles in which we can actually consolidate learning. So we've spent some time looking today at 5 skills. I said that these skills would make teaching easier and more effective. Hopefully that's a conclusion that you're willing to jump into with me. When we understand what learning is, we design teaching experiences that make it easier to learn. So we spend a lot less time trying to cram information into unwilling brains. It's a lot easier and it's more effective. When we use data, we can save time and energy and choose our battles. We can also see what's working and do more of that. Sounds a lot easier to me than constantly tossing spaghetti against the wall. When it comes to differentiating instruction, I hope I was able to give you some insight into ways of differentiating that are both scalable and effective based on students' cognitive strengths and the areas they need support in. As far as grading is concerned, I hope I've made at least part of the case that all that work we spend quantifying and averaging and calculating are mostly counterproductive. Maybe less grading with better feedback and options. And that certainly, I would find that easier. And finally, I think we have a wonderful opportunity to support teachers in utilizing more effective learning practices themselves, simply for the value that would help them derive from professional development, but also for the advantage it would give them in helping their students learn to be better learners. So we have a few more minutes before we hit the top of the hour, and I would like to open things up to questions. I'm not sure whether my colleague Karen has been able to join us today, so I'm going to need to look at the chat window myself. Oh, Karen is. So Karen, hopefully you've been tracking questions as we were going along, and would love to, maybe you can let me know if you've seen any. Oh, I see. If it's been debunked, why did they drill it? You know, that's because there's so many myths about neuroscience and brains and learning that have been drilled into us and through the popular media and through misinterpretations. It's really remarkable. Even if there's some studies that have been done on teachers' misperceptions and belief in what are called neuromyths. Things like whether we only use 10% of our brain. Well, I promise you, we use all of our brain. If we didn't use all of our brain, we wouldn't have it. We are always using all of our brain. All of our brain is ready to respond, to connect, to do what it needs to do to help us survive. Things like, right brain and left brain. The hemispheres of our brain do specialize to some degree, but basically they can't do anything, almost anything independently. And so almost everything we do requires us to use both sides of our brains, and they have to work together. So our brains are always working together across all the different areas. Oh boy, bring information and data. Well, I'm happy to talk to anybody who, I'm talking about anybody about any of this. I love having an opportunity to talk to teachers because at the end of the day, they're set in their ways, but I don't know too many teachers. Maybe there are some of them who really don't want to get it, who really don't care about their students, who really don't. And they're set in their ways because it's comfortable. One of the things we have to recognize is that whenever we're changing our brains, for students or for teachers or for any of us, it takes energy to change it. And so there's going to be some resistance. And that's why we need to figure out what's important, what's really relevant to teachers, and help them understand how what we want to do is going to help them get there. And for some teachers, my hypothesis would be that making teaching easier would be something they would be interested in. You know, we work really hard. Teachers work really hard. Making it a little bit easier might appeal to them. Karen, any other questions that you've seen? Oh, I love that. My husband says I teach throughout the night. You are. That's exactly what you're doing. Okay, so I'm not hearing Karen. So a great point. So Eric is sharing that he works in special education, and of course, each of his students is very different, and he has technology. Technology can be a very powerful differentiator, and I should have I've said that. For example, there are programs that this is not necessarily just for special ed, but things like Literacy Planet that help you differentiate and provide different focus on learning experiences and levels and things for students through technology, which is a huge benefit to teachers. Without that, it's very, very difficult to do, as I'm sure Eric would underscore. And so he's using multiple sensory opportunities as well for his students to learn. So he's really looks like doing wonderful things that are very consistent with what we know about brains and how they learn. Okay, well, we're a few minutes past. I apologize for going over, but I just want to thank everybody so much for being here today, for helping me share some of what I'm passionate about, what I would love to be able to share with others. So if you'd like to continue the conversation, if you have questions that we didn't get to today, I will go back and check the chat list. But if there's anything that has come up or comes up later, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to connect with you and hope we will have an opportunity to continue the conversation. I also hope you'll join us for another webinar sometime soon. And thanks again and have an absolutely fabulous day.